Thank you for joining our talk today entitled Bringing Improved Person Metadata into Digital Archives. I am Jeff Good, presenting. The work that we are discussing today comes out of research undertaken within the Key Pluridisciplinary Advances in African Multilingualism Cameroon Project, or PAMCOM for short. We've included the URL for the project website, pamcom.org, on the slide in case you want to learn more about it. Our focus here today is not work directly coming out of the PAMCOM project, but rather some of the lessons that we think our experiences doing this work have for documentary practices around collecting and encoding metadata about the people whose language use is recorded in documentary work. Our original target region of research in PAMCOM was Lower Fungom, a small area of Cameroon with around 8 distinct local languages and a high amount of individual level multilingualism, with the average adult knowing around 5 languages. To give a sense of the kind of documentary recordings that we are working with, where expanded person metadata is important for understanding patterns of language use, we'll begin by providing a concrete example of a multilingual language exchange that took place in Lower Fungom and which was reported and worked by Rachel Ojong Diba. The conversational fragment presented on this slide primarily begins with an interchange between 2 people, Kulani and Pa Joshua. The exchange uses 2 languages of Lower Fungom, each associated with one of Lower Fungom's villages, namely Aba and Bu. In this dialogue, turns in Aba are coded in blue, and turns in Bu are coded in red. As you can see, Kulani is speaking to Pa Joshua in Aba, and Pa Joshua is responding to Kulani in Bu. At the end of the part of the exchange presented here, Kulani switches to Bu when he speaks to some boys who are nearby, and he also chooses Bu when he's speaking with a chicken in the area. This raises an analytical question. What factors govern the choice of language used by Kulani and Pa Joshua in this exchange? And this in turn raises another question about data collection and metadata curation, namely, what kind of metadata would we need to have collected to make sense of the language choices in this exchange? We want to start by considering Kulani's language choice when he's addressing the chicken, in part because it's not obvious to us what the appropriate choice of language should be when talking to an animal in Lower Fungom. Here are some relevant points of information, though, for understanding this exchange. First, it takes place in the village of Bu, so we might imagine that Bu would serve as the default language in such a context. Second, within the context of this interchange, everyone would understand Bu. So if Kulani wants to make sure everyone knows what he said to the chicken, that's an appropriate choice of language. Third, recall that the interchange starts out as being between Kulani and Pa Joshua. Pa Joshua knows Bu. Kulani also knows Aba, so they both know each of those 2 languages. But if Kulani uses Bu, he knows that he will be understood by Pa Joshua. However, this last point leads to a different question. If both Kulani and Pa Joshua know both Bu and Aba, maybe the primary consideration, the primary thing we should be considering is not why Kulani chose to speak to the chicken in Bu, but rather why he chose to address Pa Joshua in Aba. This fact is actually surprising if one knows more about the context, namely that Pa Joshua is actually from Bu, and Kulani grew up in Bu, which means that Kulani is seen as having a close connection to that village. And perhaps most importantly, Pa Joshua is senior to Kulani. And the junior-senior relationship is one of the most important factors determining social interactions in Lower Fungom. In fact, based on the work of Rachel Ojong Diba, we've been able to understand a number of important rules determining language choice among multilinguals interacting in Lower Fungom. First, the senior-junior relationship is central to social interactions, and a junior person should defer to the senior person across various dimensions of social behavior, including language choice. Second, the choice of language normally reflects the nature of the relationship holding between 2 people. Third, the choice of a local lexicogrammatical code during an exchange should normally be stable within the scope of that interaction. That is, there's not a lot of code mixing among the local languages when 2 people are speaking to each other in Lower Fungom. However, it's also the case, as we say in 4, that it is possible to change codes within a specific interaction to achieve specific social ends, such as a desire to maintain secrecy, To be widely understood, by contrast, as well, you might change your code for that reason, or perhaps most interestingly in the present context, to signal irritation or anger. And it's this last point that's crucial to understanding Kulani's language choice with both Pa Joshua and the chicken. In the interchange that we showed earlier, Kulani was actually angry with Pa Joe due to an earlier aspect of their interaction that day. Normally, Kulani should speak to his elder, Pa Joshua, in Boo, out of deference to the fact that Pa Joshua is from Boo. However, since Kulani is actually angry at Pa Joshua, he uses a ba instead as a means to signal social distance from Pa Joshua. Kulani goes even further than this when he chooses to speak to the chicken in Boo, however, because this suggests that his connection to the chicken is closer than his connection to Pa Joshua, something which is very impolite in the local social context. This is a deliberately complex example, but we believe it illustrates the need to have a more detailed approach to person metadata than is typical for most documentary projects. And we'll develop what we believe is needed. We'll further develop that in the rest of this talk. Let's first look at how person metadata is encoded in some common metadata standards. And we'll start here with the Open Language Archives Community, or OLAC metadata standard. OLAC metadata is primarily designed for resource discovery as opposed to archive management, but we believe it is still useful to see how it handles person metadata. Consider this record, for example, of a resource in the Dobus archive describing for the Ukan language of Nigeria. This is the version of the metadata record for this resource in the OLAC format. In this record, there is some information available about the people involved in the recording. However, it's quite limited. Names are given, though their structure isn't clear. Presumably, we're seeing a given name followed by a surname. And the roles that these individuals have with respect to the creation of this specific resource is also provided. We see from this record that there's one speaker, one researcher, and one annotator. If we go back to our earlier example from Lower Fungom, though, we could ask how the speaker here, Adeson Miobaude, might choose to speak to a chicken if he wanted to address one. Unfortunately, from this metadata record, we couldn't even begin to guess this based on the information that we have. Among other things, we don't even know what languages Adeson Miobaude knows, other than the fact that he knows Ukan, and maybe some variety of English as well. The IMDI metadata standard, illustrated here through the LaMeda tool, allows for more detailed information to be provided about people whose language use is documented. Consider, for example, how LaMeda allows information about a speaker's language profile to be encoded. In particular, it's possible to list the languages that someone knows, and whether or not this was a primary language of their mother or father using the male-female icons to the right of the language name. This is still quite limited. For instance, we cannot directly enter the extent of the individual's proficiency in the languages that they know, but this is still clearly much more informative than what's possible using the OLAC standard. In addition, LaMeda makes it easy to keep track of information about people separately from the metadata associated with specific resources, as seen in this example of a screenshot for session metadata using LaMeda. Specifically, you can specify that a session involved contributions from people described elsewhere, and the only specific information added in the context of the session metadata is the role that those individuals had in the event being recorded. The LaMeda approach is clearly more effective at addressing the problem at hand than the OLAC approach, but it's still missing some key kinds of information. Within our own work on multilingualism in Cameroon, we actually go much further in our data collection than what is envisioned in current metadata standards. For example, for each consultant that we work with, we collect information using a detailed sociolinguistic interview guide, where we ask for basic demographic information, alongside information about an individual's parents, spouses, and children. The sociolinguistic interview guide is sort of an evolving instrument that we use, and it's adjusted and adapted as we learn more about local social structures and social norms. In addition to this information about an individual, for each language that they say that they know, we ask questions about it, such as their level of competence in the language, how they learned it, where they use it, and why they use it, among other things. However, even with all of this information, which goes far beyond other existing metadata standards, we still won't have all of the information we would need to understand what language a person might choose to speak with a chicken. In particular, we're missing information on how each contributor to an event that is recorded is related to one another. Who is senior? Who is junior? Are they related by blood? Are they friends? How well do they know each other's linguistic repertoire? and other relevant questions to understanding how they choose to interact during a given event. Based on the observations above, we'd like to use the rest of this talk to present an overall conceptual model for expanded person metadata of the sort that we have found is needed in our own research. At least some of the features that we think are needed are likely to be useful more generally. First, it's helpful to emphasize that the current metadata approaches that are widely used are based on an event-centered approach to metadata cataloging. Specifically, they take some kind of real-world event where language is used as the primary conceptual basis that documentary records are built on. Video and audio recordings directly capture key features of the event, and textual representations, for instance in the form of annotations, capture additional aspects of the event. These resources are then bundled together, sometimes in a bundle referred to as a session, and associated with metadata describing the resources associated with the event. This includes metadata about the individuals involved in the underlying event. However, people are not the primary object of description. Rather, information about people is provided as a means of characterizing the event itself. By contrast, our proposed approach does not treat events as uniquely privileged with respect to the collection and encoding of metadata. It also recognizes people as being directly associated with metadata to complement metadata associated with events. The step where we have made the most progress in our own work is in the idea of collecting information relevant to constructing a language profile for each consultant that we work with. This is based on information gathered via the sociolinguistic interview guide that we discussed above, and we extract specific information from it, and in particular, information most relevant to understanding an individual's linguistic choices and interaction to create an abbreviated profile. Of course, when doing this, we make sure to only extract and make publicly available information that doesn't raise significant concerns with regard to privacy. Furthermore, conceptually, people can be coded as directly related to events rather than coded as indirectly participating in them via resource metadata. We depict that here, though we have not yet implemented this step directly, and as is the case for most projects, participants in events in our own metadata can only be discovered through the metadata associated with specific resource bundles. On top of this kind of metadata for people, the language profile metadata, there's also a need for social network metadata to be collected among individuals who participate in the creation of a documentary corpus. We are not currently encoding this systematically in our work. Rather, if it is recorded, it would only be found in the description associated with a session or resource bundle, or in an analytical output, such as an article or a PhD thesis. However, as our example with Kulani, Pa Joshua, and the chicken shows, as we saw in the beginning of this talk, social network information plays a crucial role in understanding an individual's speech choices in the context of a given event. As clarified in this slide, social network data is different, or metadata is different from language profiles, since it is inherently relational rather than being about a specific person. Therefore, to fully develop person metadata in the way that we think is needed here, it's necessary to have both language profiles and a separate specification of the social network relations holding among those who participated in the development of a corpus. While general social network metadata schemes already exist, they are not frequently used in documentary work, as far as we are aware. The above observations lead us then to a series of general recommendations regarding extensions to existing metadata practice. Some of these have been more explicitly developed in this talk than others, but we see each of them as important in their own right. First, we believe it is necessary to elevate individuals to become first-order objects in metadata schemes. Second, if people are to be treated as first-order objects in metadata schemes, we will need to make sure we can keep track of people within a corpus, and at least in some cases across corpora. This will require more attention to consistency in how names are entered and how people are identified than is typical of most work today. Third, language documentation would benefit from shared recommendations about the minimal information that should be collected about people so that we can understand their linguistic behavior. While most projects will not use an extensive sociolinguistic interview guide of the sort that we use in PomCom, almost all documentary work could benefit from more information being collected about people than is typically the case. Fourth, as just discussed, we need standardized ways of encoding relationships among individuals who contributed to a corpus, that is, social network metadata. Finally, since language use can be heavily conditioned by locally significant social categories, such as the senior-junior relationship in Lower Fungom, We need to make sure that these can be encoded in metadata alongside more universally oriented categories as well. Importantly, while we are recommending some significant changes in practice, it's not necessary to start from scratch here. Existing standards such as friend of a friend or FOIF RDF can be adapted for modeling social network metadata, for example, and traditional knowledge or TK labels provides a useful approach for managing certain kinds of culturally specific categories. Ultimately, we believe that investing in expanding metadata encoding practices along the lines of what we propose here is actually necessary if we are to fully realize the promise of language documentation to create transparent records of language use that can be used for multiple purposes. And also, if we are to make sure that the community members who make documentary work possible are fully represented in archives as people, rather than being treated primarily as vehicles through which language resources are created. Thank you for your time and attention.